Pakistan in transition. So we are very honored to have SARTORI with us, and today he will be talking about intellectual history and history of capital.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to stand so that I can do that swaying thing when I get anxious. Okay, so I've offered, as you know, one does when you get asked to give a topic, I'm like, oh, I'll just talk on something small like intellectual history and the history of capital in Bengal, because I didn't want to stretch myself too far or too thin. So, needless to say, I'm going to cover that topic extensively and in every detail imaginable. No. So, instead, what I wanted to do is just lay out a problem and rethink the way we think that connection. And I should say at the beginning, you know, intellectual history itself as a field is not necessarily one that has been very clearly conceptualized for Bengal in general anywhere. So I should be clear what I mean when I say intellectual history, because I'm really not interested I'm not interested in doing intellectual history in any kind of traditional sense as the history of, you know, the relationship between this famous person and that famous person. When I think about intellectual history, what I'm really thinking about is the way in which concepts get formed, the way in which ways of thinking develop. And one way into that is by examining the sort of textual material one would look at as a sort of traditional intellectual historian. But the problem I have in mind is much bigger than that and doesn't revolve around connections between intellectuals in any kind of traditional sense. And it certainly doesn't rely, as I hope to talk about today, on demarcating some kind of arbitrary line that separates people who count as intellectuals and people who don't count as intellectuals. Because in some fundamental sense, we are all concept users, hopefully, okay? We are all concept users, and the problem I'm trying to lay out is to think about how can we think historically about the availability of concepts to us. And the specific problem, there's many problems one could think that through, but the specific issue I want to focus on is the way in which certain concepts become available to us and transformations in social relationships. I won't go into any more abstruse detail about that, but I'll just sort of launch. I just want to say that to the extent that there has been an intellectual history of modern Bengal, it's always been understood in relation to the history of capital. It's been very central to the historiographical tradition. But mostly through an intermediary term. That term is obviously colonialism. The concept of colonialism was never in the literature fully congruent with the category capitalism. They were never exactly the same thing or deemed to be exactly the same thing. Obviously, colonialism has been conceptualized either as a cultural or a political or both form. Capitalism is a concept that either exceeds or falls outside of or only partially overlaps in those categories. But there are few scholars, even among those most inclined to a post-colonialist cultural analysis of colonialism, for whom capital is not a central element in the agency of colonialism or in the political forms of colonialism, for example, governmentality, or the purpose of colonialism, just to put it as simply as possible. What was empire for? In the 20th century, the classic literature that would overlap with intellectual history of Bengal has overwhelmingly construed this relationship from a top-down perspective, right? The relationship between intellectual history and the history of capital being viewed from the top. And what I mean by this is that the colonial state or parastate agents have been understood to exercise the agency of capital, and indigenous society is the site that is acted upon. It's an agent-patient relationship, right? So that to the extent that there was, say, in subaltern studies, an attempt to recapture the agency in the colonized society, it was implicit that, actually it was explicit in the writings of Ranjit Guha, for example, that the very recapturing of that indigenous agency, subaltern agency, was precisely because it fell outside of the domain of capital, right? That it was external to capital, and hence formed a site of resistance and anti-colonial politics. This would be true, let's say, of Ranjit Guha's Rule of Property, as well as of his later work, Dominance Without Hegemony. It's true within the Marxist tradition itself of the semi-feudalism thesis. Right? The whole semi-feudalism thesis, which entered into the subaltern studies tradition, but is obviously much broader than that tradition, which basically functions in on the premise that there is a kind of articulation between capital and non-capitalist modes of social relationship, right? Modes of production. It's also visible in the prominence that the indigo question has had in the historiography of the 19th century. Right? That prominence is precisely because indigo is a very easy example of what has been called coercive commercialization. Right? It's a very straightforward example. And above all, I think it expresses itself in the emphasis on mobilization as a concept. Right? That is to say, mobilization / manipulation. The idea that the way one could think about the relationship between ideas and capital is primarily in terms of the way in which one could manipulate certain kinds of relationships to mobilize populations behind interests, which are then identified with capital. Right? So we have there Partha Chatterjee's nationalist thought in the colonial world would be the classic example, I would say, of this kind of argument. And we have an argument about reason, a certain kind of conceptual arrangement, which then attempts to bring external elements, subaltern populations, within its command, right? And this happens through his moments of departure, maneuver, and arrival. Now, in this conceptualization, broadly speaking, this kind of top-down and ultimately kind of instrumental relationship, where ideas are used in order to bring non-capitalist elements under the control of capital as an external kind of agency. The relationship of the colonial ruler to the colonized, to the extent that capital is an element of that relationship, could be understood in three not mutually exclusive ways. Colonizer is to colonize as capital is to labor. It's the simplest one, and it has been, saturated with the field. Two, colonizer is to colonize as capitalist social relationships are to pre-capitalist social relationships. Very similar kind of, but not quite the same proposition, right? Because it assumes, in that sense, that there might be relationships of exploitation on both sides, but that the relationships of exploitation in Bengali society are feudal, and the relationships of exploitation that structure Western society are capitalist. And it's by coming together that we have the semi-feudalistic thesis. And finally, colonizer is to colonize as governmental rationality is to non-modern modes of power. That would be the kind of post-colonialist Foucauldian re-articulation of that thesis. Now, I should acknowledge here, and I can't go into detail, that there are counter stories, and there always have been. Right? So this is not as if these are the only stories that are being told. And more in recent times, the most obvious counter stories would be the importance of indigenous commerce in early modernity. Right? So, in this sense, we have a story about commercialization. The enabling moment that allowed that literature to emerge was the refusal to consider commerce automatically as a moment of capital, capitalism, right? That is to say, to distinguish between commercial capital and modern capital, and then to study in a non-teleological way, well, what did early modern commercial capital look like? Right? This was, say, something that Sanjay Subramanian did in his work, where he said instead of trying to figure out the issue of potentiality and transition, just what was it? Right? That was a very important maneuver. What it also did was allow us to think about certain kinds of developments in early modern history whose relationship to colonialism is ambiguous at best. Right? And obviously, that's a topic that people are arguing about a great deal. Similarly, Richard Eaton's arguments about land speculators in eastern Bengal, right? This is another kind of argument here where he talks about the way in which land is reclaimed is actually undertaken by essentially, if you like, real estate speculators, right? People who are willing to invest money with a view primarily to rental income, right? And again, a non-capitalist but highly commercialized relationship. And one of the larger questions that's going to sort of overshadow literature to come, I hope, is the question of the ways in which the history of capital and the history of highly developed commercialization might have intersected at different historical moments. Okay. Now, the stories I want to talk about today, however, don't proceed from this characterization of colonizer is colonized as capital is to labor or any of those variations, but rather, I think, suggests that that very way of thinking about the problem is itself part of the history. Right? That is to say, the attempt to distinguish between colonizer and colonizer as capital and labor is itself actually a product of an intellectual history that has emerged within the history of Bengal, and that's what I'm pointing towards. In the process, I want to suggest that this way of reframing the issue as thinking about that as an internal problematic rather than our own analytical framework, right? In other words, instead of saying this is how I'm going to analyze, this is actually what I want to analyze, right? That very structure of thinking about the problem. That this way of reframing the issue has substantial consequences for how we think about the history of concepts in modern Bengal. Because what it means is undoing what I think is an increasingly casual habit of aligning the history of capital singularly with the history of colonial power. And then positioning the history of the colonized as something by definition external to capital. I mean, this is most explicitly argued in Ranjit Gupta's work, but I think it is actually something that is implicit in a lot of arguments that are circulating at the moment. The emergence of anti-colonial thought in 19th century and 20th century Bengal was itself premised on the internalization of certain ways of thinking, certain conceptual frameworks, that I want to argue really only make sense in relationship to forms of social organization that I would describe as capitalist. It's the central thesis that I really want to argue. In other words, rather than thinking about a relationship to capitalism as by definition being a relationship that is aligned with the colonial, I want to suggest that a relationship with capitalism could also align you with being anti-colonial. And thinking about that makes it possible for us to think about that relationship as itself a historical product. While anti-colonial thought in the colonial period tended to be anti-capitalist in its own self-conception, it understood itself to be anti-capitalist, the forms of anti-capitalism that were expressed took off from presuppositions that themselves presumed that social relationships were of a certain kind, that social interdependency was of a certain kind, that human beings stood in relationship to each other in certain kinds of ways. I hope that will become clearer by giving some specific examples. I'd rather abstruse, I realise. So, I think we can see this most centrally by focusing on the role the concept, not the practice, the concept of labour played in anti-colonial and anti-capitalist thinking. I want to give as examples two conceptual fields that played a central role in anti-capitalist thinking in the later 19th and early 20th century as illustrations. The first is culture, and the second is political economy. That's basically culture being my first book and political economy being my second book. Okay, so let's start with culture. I'm going to take us briefly into the dreaded world of the Bengal Renaissance for a moment, but you'll just have to stick with me, okay? When Bonkin elaborated what he called the doctrine of culture in the 1880s, he marked a sharp break from the liberalism that he himself had advocated in the preceding decade. The author of Equality now renounced the ideal of equality. And he also announced, along with equality, political economy. He says this quite explicitly. In fact, his argument, his earlier liberal argument, had linked political economy and liberty quite closely together. Right? Liberty and equality and political economy all kind of stuck to each other in the liberal version. This whole connection, this whole cluster of concepts is what he disavows. And he says that civil society, that world where individuals interact with each other, that incorporates also commercial society, liberal society, if you will, fails to deliver its own emancipating promise. Now, instead of being the space of freedom, it turns out that civil society is the space of unfreedom. He bemoans the absorption of Indian bureaucratic and clerical functionaries, the Babu, into the structures of civil society. The reduction of society into what he called a giant marketplace saw ethically, aesthetically, and physically crippled Babus embracing a habit of heartless isolation as the empty shadow of a more substantial life of independence. Right? It's a false freedom. But Bonkin would refuse the choice between what he called belly philosophy, the individual as motivated by self-interest, material self-interest on the one hand, and what was posited as its alternative, spirituality, otherworldliness, not being of this world. Instead, what he turned to was the concept of culture, onushilo. Now, I said he makes that equation between onushilo and culture explicitly. He says, for me, this is what this word means. It represents for him a third way. The cultivation of innate human capacities into a harmonious whole. That's the definition of what culture is for him. The cultivation of innate human capacities into a harmonious whole through the emulation of an embodied image of perfection, Krishna. And this emulation then allows disavowal of slavery to material interests, desire, and the enhancement of human rational agency in the world. Right? I cultivate my capacities into a harmonious whole. I release myself from slavery to material things, but I actually become more capable of acting in the world than I ever was before. Not otherworldliness, and it's not belly philosophy. Yeah? The freedom that the principle of culture promised was a freedom from the world, but entirely in the world. Yeah? And it was one that functioned both at the level of individual freedom, individual cultivation of agency, and at the level of society. Because when I cultivate my individual capacities as a harmonious whole, I set myself in harmony with other individuals who have cultivated their capacities in a harmonious whole. And what I therefore do is create the possibility of an organic social organization. The social organism functions as the means for organizing such cultivation in the first place. How can I cultivate myself except through the social? Through hierarchical arrangements of vertical emulation, guru and disciple, husband and wife, parent and child. And the coordination of collective action as well. Right? We can now finally become a powerful nation because we can understand our harmonious relations to each other only when we have a society that produces us as harmonious individuals and therefore become the building blocks of a harmonious society. This is entirely an argument whose central issue is agency in the world. Right? The result is a vision of human being that understood humanity in terms of the totality of human capacities organized harmoniously as the foundation of social existence. In direct contrast to the anomic heteronomy of impersonal political economic laws, chaos, anarchy of civil society. Right? We have a society organized organically versus a society of chaotic individuals seeking their own self-interest. This conception of functional organic integration, Bonkin was partly borrowing from Comte, the French atheist. But Bonkin identified the French atheist as the greatest religious thinker that Europe had ever produced. Right? This tells us where the emphasis of his philosophy is. It's worldly agency. Yeah. The social order capable of underpinning such a system of culture didn't have to be made from nothing. According to him, the great privilege of India was Hinduism. Why? Because in Hinduism, vertical emulation, these relationships, was already in place, corruptly, but nonetheless in the seed, as it were. Right? And these relationships, by being purified, could found a new social order. Now, what I want to draw your attention to here is not just the agency issue, it's also the labor issue. Okay. Now, when he talks about cultivating innate capacities, he's actually also talking about things like a taste for sweets. Right? It's not just like, you know, learning how to dig a trench or how to be an engineer or something like that, right? It's all sorts of different things. But all of these things, which he lists under the category culture, what's important about them is not individually that they are a capacity, but that that capacity be cultivated in its proper relationship to the other capacities. Right? It's the relationship between the capacities that regulates the cultivation of each one. Because otherwise you might cultivate something too much. Right? So for example, I have a capacity to be angry. And that's important because, of course, partly I have to be able to be angry. But if I cultivate my capacity to be angry excessively, then I become a pretty awful person. Right? So each capacity needs to be cultivated only to the degree in which it can stand in harmony with my other capacities. Each action is part of this larger set of relationships that integrate the individual, but also integrate the individual into a social order, which is itself the embodiment of multiple activities. The proper cultivation of each capacity is fundamentally a social activity. Right? When I cultivate my own harmony, what I am doing is reproducing within myself the ideal sets of relationships that appertain at the level of society as a whole. It is, as it were, to bring the entire division of labour into my person and render it harmonious. I am the division of labour, harmoniously construed. And only because of that can I conceptualize society as a whole as a harmonious division of labour. I now understand that even though I am someone who worked with my head and you are someone who works with your hands, I'm not just someone who works with my head, I'm someone who also understands what it is to work with my hands, and I realize that it's only by bringing head and hands together that we form a society. Yeah? In this sense, the kinds of actions, even a taste for sweets, are in fact forms of labour. And what I mean by this is that they are ways in which when I act upon nature, what I am actually doing is creating relationships to other people. I'll elaborate that with my second example of political economy. But what I want to suggest to you is that when culture emerges as a central concept in the late 19th century, it emerges as a way of talking about labour. Right? And it emerges as a way of talking about labour in a very particular way. That is, that labour, everyone has always had to labour through history. Labour is something very peculiar, though, in this notion. Labour is not just a relationship of human beings with nature, it's also a relationship of human beings to each other. Yeah. This is what I want to suggest is actually central to our category of capital, and I'll come to that in a moment. But what it means is even a concept like culture is actually a way of talking about labour in this very historically specific sense. I have no idea. Oh, what time did we start? What time? Okay, I'll move quickly then. Okay, now this kind of argument would actually become most explicit in the Swadeshi period. And it would develop into an argument that was explicitly about political economy sometimes, right? So for example, in Swadeshi argument, it would be the colonial state is an exploitative capital agency. What we need for capitalist agency, what we need to be able to do is develop our own national abilities. And if we can have our own national abilities, because we as a society, after all, are organized ethically rather than capitalistically, civil society. We are an ethical society organized by these relationships. Then what we can do is take our stand in the native and throw off the colonial. Yeah. So we would have, sorry, I'm just going to try and move forward quickly through this because I've taken much more time than I should have on this first example. Okay, but the Swadeshi movement, as you probably know, failed, right? What was crucial about its failure is that it failed in its own self-understanding, not just because of colonial repression, but also because of the failure of people to live up to what were ostensibly their own ethical ideals. So, for example, it failed because people didn't want to buy Swadeshi goods, because other goods were cheaper. It failed because people didn't want to send their kids to national schools, because, you know what, they were more likely to get a job if they went to the government school. And so it actually turned out in this argument that, Indian civilization acted in ways that seemed strikingly bourgeois, self-interested. The figure that bore the burden of this failure more than any other was what I called in the book the Muslim popular. Right? That is to say, the Muslim popular became the most obvious figure who refused to act in accordance with the Swadeshi ideal. In this sense, the Bengali Muslim became identified in a wide range of post-Swadeshi Padrolo thought as emblematic of the ethical failure in Indian society. The Muslim was a terrifying combination of ravenous self-interest in this conception and also of collective action and also, worst of all, of productive activity. Because the problem is that the Muslim also turned out to be the producer. And this is something that is actually dealt with very explicitly in, for example, Aurobindo's thought in 1908, 1999. This is a real heart-burning problem for him, and he actually says the Padrolog need to return to the soil, as indeed the Padrolog need to return to the soil, or else we will not exist. But what I want to point out to you is that this negative stereotypical representation of the Bengali Muslim wasn't without a referent in the world. And I don't mean obviously to say that this is a correct characterization, but what I mean is this: that agrarian politics from the late 19th century had come to center on claims about rights. And Bengali Muslim politics, to the extent that we attach that crucial first Bengali Muslim politics, was centrally preoccupied with the question of rights. And at the center of the question of rights was a language of property. And the claim that was at the core of this kind of political mobilization, I would argue, is that property results from labor. The entire attack upon the zamindari system was precisely that this was a politically constituted form of property. It's not real property, it's just oppression. It's not property as property should be, it's just being made up. My property, me now being the Proja, is real because I cleared the jungle. Well, not me necessarily, but my forebears. We cleared the jungle. We put our, sweat and blood into the soil. That is why the soil is ours. And in this sense, it is real property. Now, I just want to point out to you the kind of logical structure that underlies that. What it says is, what is property? Property is a relationship between people. It's a relationship between people that in this case arises when I act upon nature. In other words, this entire language of right and property turns on a particular way of thinking about what labour is. What I would basically, just to finish up, say is that if you look at the history of agrarian politics from the second half of the 19th century, it is impossible to understand that politics without recognizing that it is internally organized by political economic presuppositions. That is to say, by ideas about what labor is, and what labor does, and what labor means. I would suggest that this is not a set of presuppositions that would have ever meant anything. I can finesse that distinction in, let's say, the 10th century. I realize there is an argument about occupancy right that goes back from long before the colonial period. But I think its logic is radically different, and I'll be happy to talk about that. So in this sense, this is also an intellectual history. Why? Because I'm talking about the history of political economic concepts and how it is that they become ways of making sense of the world and acting in the world. Not just for intellectuals, not just for bonk, but in fact for a much broader range of people. In each of these cases, these are two very different forms of anti-capitalism, right? Agrarian politics will emerge into, let's say, a whole range of politics across the board from left to right. But all of them understand themselves in some sense to be anti-capitalist. They're pitched in sharp disjuncture from, let's say, the culturalist politics of the Swadeshi era, which also understood itself to be anti-capitalist. But neither of these conceptual fields can be at all understood without understanding the way in which they make sense of what social relationships are. And at the core of that understanding is the concept of labour. Stop there. I can maybe elaborate more in questions
Ask questions.
If you have no questions, I can just keep talking.
I would like to start from the two things standing up together in a perspective. You can take the connection from it. The first question is like, you know, subaltern to being an externality of like the capitalist mode of production and social relation as such. But isn't that in itself the criteria for capital to exist? Like, you know, capital does not have to have an inclusive system. Capital can always sort of function through multiplied sorts of externalities, even externalities which it did not know or did not acknowledge in its own sort of preconception. That's one thing. And the second one is the position of the ethical society or the civil society, however we might call it. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think in the second chapter of Capital, Marx makes a rather naive but ultimately an interesting observation, and it's almost him in his sort of Nostradamus mode. He's sort of saying, only if the sort of where the sort of mode of exchanges are sort of happening, if only there is a general field of knowledge, if everybody sort of carries a certain level of knowledge, we can sort of see capitalism disenfranchising itself in the long run. But recently, two people, my points of contact is, of course, I would also like to know how you sort of add in Heidegger in the way you sort of see this. But my 2 points of reference would be one, Frederick Jameson, whose recent book about capital is not that we sort of see capital as this magical component, but radical as sort of creation of unemployment, creation of externalities as such. And the second one would be a quick example, because I'm not very good with dialectics myself. If we sort of consider in today's world, like, you know, what sort of capitalists do we say Bill Gates is? We can't really say, okay, they're paying their workers cheap labor, or it's exploitation on a large scale. Are we not, in a way, moving back to the sort of rental economy? It's not profit anymore, but we share a space for which we pay a rent. So it's ethical, thank you very much. But what I am trying to get at is that, is there any way of sort of privatizing this sort of civil society as such, so that anything which sort of goes against capital or capitalist modes of production is already sort of for it, if you know what I mean. So I'll stop there.
Sure, that's fine. I'm not sure why subaltern is the premise of capitalism, that there has to be an outside in order to make sense of it, but that's a thing. Empirically, clearly there's an outside to capitalism. I'm not suggesting that. There still is, and in fact, partly that outside is something that capitalism itself throws up, like, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa for the 1970s and 80s was basically an area that was basically expelled. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that it was expelled. This goes to your Jamison question in a sense. It was expelled in such a way that its condition of bare existence was not one that was the same as what it was before. To be expelled from capitalism in Sub-Saharan Africa was not an emancipation from colonialism. It was not like, now we're free. Right? We are no longer subject to capital, and it turns out that we are much, much worse off than we ever were when we were subject to capital. Right? So this tells us something about the very conditions of existence, right? That being deprived of capital could be a condition of the supreme condition of suffering. Right? That this is the worst condition in the contemporary world, is not to be subject to capital. Right? Not exploitation, but the reality of vast numbers of people across the globe not being exploited. Right? Sub-Saharan Africa still, for example, used the language of exploitation. But the reality is that the problem was the exact opposite. Right? Nobody wanted their tin. Right? To put it simply. And in terms of the capitalist, so there's two things. The rental economy is very important, and obviously not just at the level of things like intellectual property and electronic products, where it isn't entirely a rental economy, right? In this sense, it is pre-capitalist in its logic. It's about like carving out spaces of control, and in this sense, property in that sense becomes an ever more political form, right? In this sense, that to be able to have a property in software, you essentially have to have some kind of political agency making it property, because otherwise it'll stop being property really quickly. Software is very easy to reproduce. But I do want to point out that the capitalist, so when I'm talking about capital in this talk. I'm not talking about capitalists in that sense, right? I'm not talking about like somebody going out and making, you know, Mr. Moneybags, to use Marx's term. What I'm talking about is a prior question, which is under what condition can that kind of capitalist exist? Any kind of capitalist exist. And the capitalist that Marx is talking about is a capitalist who earns through deploying labour, modern capital. And in that sense, there's a whole series of consequences that flow from that. But I would argue that the capitalist who can earn by using labour is the capitalist who exists in a society where labour is itself a medium of social relationship. And that's what I mean by calling this capitalist. The other point I want to make about this is the commons. You didn't say it, but it was a word that immediately popped into my mind as the antithesis of the capitalist. What strikes me more than there's a lot of literature coming out at the moment, you know, reclaiming the commons and keeping the commons. The commons is a part of agrarian politics in Bengal in the 19th and 20th century. What's really amazing to me is how little a part it is. The issue of the commons is barely present. It's there. If you look at the manifestos of RAC organisations, they mention, you know, the Zamindar shouldn't be able to settle people on the lands that we use as public lands in the village. That's as much as the commons comes up. You know what the RAC politics is about? From top to bottom, from sharecroppers to jotdars, the entire question is about give us property. It's about consolidate property rights. We want rights in the land. And we want them, initially, at the level of private rights. Even the communists in the 1930s are saying this. The communists in the 1930s say as their official position, we need to generalize property rights, because if we can generalize property rights, then cooperation can begin. It is the universal language of agrarian politics in the 1920s and 1930s. This language of property has been based on labour. And this strikes me as something quite remarkable, right? Given that now the language of resistance is all about the commons. It becomes very complicated, right? Because in a sense, if you think about the issue of special economic zones, it's the commons. But the commons is now acting on the side of so-called capitalists, right? This is an entire switch around, and it's something that's an interesting historical problem.
This is about timelines. After the coming of the British until the permanent settlement, we see an explosion of commercial activities. In fact, the whole permanent settlement is funded by the surplus that was generated. And the whole Bengal Renaissance being product of maybe these 30-40 years of wealth making. Permanent settlement was an agricultural capitalist example to faith. These people who brought in, whether it's Tagore or others, were those who were produced by this commercial capital age. Yep. How did this influence their thinking subsequently, including about the Swadeshi? They were people who were very successful commercial capitalists, but pretty bad feudal, if you will. I don't call it feudal, I mean landholding order.
Yep.
How much of a disruption was it to their thinking process? Because obviously capitalism was the most dynamic system in the world at that time.
Yes, but the permanent settlement model of capitalism turns out to be kind of a failure. This is central. So what, basically the larger sort of chronology I would make is that somewhere, so pick a random date, 1848, there is a major shift. The kind of pro-commercial, pro-civil society liberal politics that you see in the 1820s and 1830s undergoes a real crisis at that moment. And from around 1848, what we see is an increasing turn on the part of precisely an elite that is being produced out of this form of, let's call it, bad weak capitalism, right? That is actually one that turns radically against the very forms of capital in general, right? Now, they may do it in bad faith. That I leave aside. The psychological dimensions of it I leave aside. But the issue of how they then form an alternative conception is one that remains highly hierarchical in giving up the idea of the kind of any form of civil society in the kind that someone like someone like Ramahan would have defended. They're not saying that we're all equal. On the contrary, right? They actually, to a much greater degree than Ramahan ever would have, emphasize relationships of vertical hierarchy. Right? So there are, in fact, the giving up of the vision of kind of commercial prosperity in favor of kind of coordinated society isn't one that then gives up on the kind of hierarchical relationships that structure society, but in fact enforces them all the more. And so in the end, where you see the language of egalitarianism emerging is agrarian politics. Right? The language of rights that Bonkin absolutely forswears in the end, explicitly forswears in the 1880s, emerges precisely there. So that capitalism now, but to think of that, you have to think about multiple histories of capitalism. Right? In other words, you can't make the history of capitalism the history of the permanent settlement. You can't understand, for example, the British may have a lot to do with it, but the permanent settlement, you can't understand, for example, reclamation of jungle in the early 19th century that leads to something that was not there in the 18th century. Vast numbers of ships plying the rice trade, right? Shifting rice from east to west, right? Now this is something that is developed and elaborated on a vast scale, right? But you can't talk about it in terms of the permanent settlement. It may have sometimes fallen within the permanent settlement and sometimes not. It sort of crosses that boundary in terms of... But it's something that you have to think about in some other historical terms. It may have to do with, partly to do with state formation and stable structures. It may have to do with, with population demand. It may have all sorts of factors. But it seems to be something that is a history of capitalism that doesn't have much to do with the permanent settlement per se, even when it operates under its shadow.
But my point that these very successful businessmen, wealth makers, suddenly go into very disastrous non-capitalist relationships.
Yeah.
And more or less destroy their control over the economy. And they never really seriously recover the economic position which Bengal had till the coming of the permanent settlement.
Yeah.
What was the intellectual push for them to give up being commercial capitalists and to become some kind of a wishy-washy?
Well, I would say it operates in a slightly different way. I mean, basically, the kind of closure of commercial life, which already is beginning to happen in the late 18th century. The British may have risen to power in part with all sorts of commercial collaboration, but they immediately begin shutting down avenues for that kind of collaboration. Someone like the Tagore family, to take an obvious example, they are very interested in maintaining commercial collaborations right down to the 1840s. But then, the Union Bank fails, and it turns out that things are hard to maintain. I would say avenues shut down for forms of commercial investment. And as avenues shut down, what happens is that, I'd say two different stories. One is avenues shut down. The very notion of being a commercial, vibrant society just becomes less and less plausible. Right? After 1848, for example, what you have is less and less of those families actually being capable of engaging in other forms. The other thing that happens is that even from within that kind of intellectual world, the liberal intellectual world, certain tensions arise. So, for example, in the Tagore family, Devendra is going to forswear the whole thing, right? And he's going to do it before 1848. He's going to say, I want freedom, but I don't really believe I can get freedom in the world, right? So I'm going to forswear the world. He is exactly who Bonkin is talking about when he talks about otherworldliness, right? This is, he's talking about Devendra. On the other hand, you have Okoye Dotto saying something along the lines of, we need to integrate ourselves into nature, right? We have to give up this whole idea of being agential. Is that the word? Yes, agential in the world. We need to actually just kind of become part of the world by organizing ourselves according to its laws, right? And this becomes like the sharpest extreme, right? I save myself as a subject by giving up the world, or I absorb myself entirely into the world as part of the natural law. These kinds of tensions have even emerged before the collapse of that kind of delicate colonial civil society that did exist, collaborative civil society that did exist right up to the 1840s, and then let its last breath out at that point and began total moribund decline after that. So how could you possibly have a politics? I mean, what would it look like? Well, it looks like being a bubble. It looks like being a clerk in somebody's office. That's what participating in civil society means, right? It means buying things that I can't really afford. It means being bullied by somebody in an office. It means desperately scrounging for employment. All of these things that are supposed to be freedom, selling my labor, turn out to look a lot kind of like a miserable lot. And this is for the bubble. Right? So that within itself, the history, there's less and less people who can, you know, the very returns from owning land from the 1870s onwards are going to go into decline, at least at, you know, at the zamindari tenure level. I mean, there may be a brief respite when after 1885 royalty rights becomes available as a means of rent getting, but the tenure system is becoming less and less of a viable way of living. It means that labor is the only way, right? We have to become clerks. That whole generation of family, of course the Tagores aren't going to come. But how many Tagores are there? Yeah. Is that?
No, I have no problem with communists as well being a producer of if you look at the education, I'm thinking about the education data, producing drugs, producing products. You guys have had no problems about becoming subservients. I don't think their politics has ever been an independent politics. But after the mid-19th century, as you put it, the public question comes in. It came in because the other issues of making a living had also failed. So it was not like some honorable, it is never an honorable or whatever, and an idea of warning, more like a survival strategy, more like producing a kind of a politics that is more congruent with the kind of economics we always face it. Because it was not part of the drug trade. It was the most profitable trade of the Brits. Bengal was producing the drugs, but they were not participating, which the Bombay elite was, the carters and the builders. So Bengal had been effectively shut out of the wealth making. So what is Bengal's politics itself for the failure to be significantly collaborative, with the opportunity of collaboration died out?
Well, I want to emphasize one thing, which is that you made an extremely important point about subservience. This is politics. This kind of offense is politics that really only makes sense after some notion of emancipation has become available. It's not something that people are going to be upset about just as a matter of anthropological course. It's just like envy or something, right? History demonstrates that not to be the case. Human beings don't have a problem with hierarchy intrinsically. But the modern politics is organized around the notion of freedom across the board, like in all its many varied forms, from far right to far left. Freedom is an organizing concept. And so the question is the question is in this sense a two-part one. The first question is, how does the problem of freedom become central? As I think it does in various forms in the first half of the 19th century, in Calcutta, let's say, and in various other parts of the country as well, not just in. And then secondly, what happens when those aspirations seem unfeasible under specific historical conditions? And the answer to that is, of course, it depends. Again, that could go in many different directions. But I think we see one set of directions that happens precisely from the mid-century amongst this kind of popular / great commercial family world. One direction, but it only makes sense if you first recognize that they've embraced the notion of emancipation. Right? That's where the wound comes from. Otherwise, there is no wound. Right.
I'm fascinated by the way you're seeing the inevitability of labor through Hindu, Mughalian cultural construct and also Muslim political political economic. Now, this how do we place that when place the political economic construct in Bengal when there is no in a particular specific spaces where there is no scope for intervention? For example, most of West Bengal, East Bengal, of course. I had some experience of exploring some primary materials. So my understanding has been is that the question is key question is rather justice rather than labor itself, particularly in Eastern Bengal in the quest of 19th century. Of course, the labor was placed as an estimating point. That yes, because my labor, this is my land. But then there were the legal questions of rights, and then ultimately it was the question of justice. So how do you see?
Draw that out.
Yes.
Okay. Let me be clear. What I'm not trying to suggest is that this is actually an adequate characterization of what agrarian society was. Right? I mean, clearly it has some reference in terms of histories of reclamation, but I'm certainly not trying to suggest that this emphasis on equity and rights, justice, is something that actually grew out of the fact that people were out there cutting down trees and digging, emptying marshes or something like that. That's not my suggestion. The question is, what is justice? And justice can be conceptualized in many different ways. But here, justice is being argued on certain kinds of principles, right? And the way, the elaboration of that claim, why should we have rights? What should those rights be? Why should we recognize each other as equal? Leads them to an argument about language, right? So yes, you could say it's a kind of a secondary justification, but I think it's a secondary justification that leads logically out of the claims that are being made in politics. It's not one that is just there as a second thought, especially because it is so pervasive, right? Across otherwise incommensurable political projects. There's the whole range of people take this as a central proposition of their politics. And as I was saying to you the other day, of course, in East Bengal this is much clearer than in West Bengal. And actually where you get the very clearest articulation of it is in the Brahmaputra Valley in Assam, up the river. It's Maulana Bashani in the 1930s and early 1940s. Because the clearest articulation of this, Assam is a settler colonial project. It's Australia. It's Australia, but with Bengali Muslims. I'm not saying that literally, obviously. I'm saying in terms of the language that is being used to this extent. There's a lot of other things going on. But to this extent, it's a settler colony in the way it's being talked about. The sons of the soil want to keep the Bengalis out. That's self-described sons of the soil. And we are here. Why are we here? Why do we get a right to be here? Because we emptied the swamps. We cut down the trees. We have improved the agriculture of this land. This is entirely the ideological framework of settler colonialism. And it's very interesting that it should emerge with someone who in no plausible way could be said to be a product of a colonial education system or some kind of argument about symbolic violence or something like that, right? I mean, this is not a plausible explanation of where this kind of argument could be coming from. Okay, so yeah, in West Bengal, it's true, it's much shallower as an argument. It's there at the level of general colonial debate, right? So, for example, it's available as a way of talking to anyone in Bengal, and it is used in West Bengal, but it certainly doesn't have the purchase that it has in East Bengal.
Thanks, Andrew. That was very interesting. I was wondering about what sort of social changes were occurring during the period that you call colonial Bengal. Something suggested that the Renaissance occurred partly as a result of participation with capitalism. But what sort of transformations were occurring in homes, on the streets, in intimate lives, that's
Okay, well we can pose that as two different questions, right? So you can say on the one hand the question of in the life of Bonkim, what kind of changes have taken place? That's easy. The other question is a broad one, right? What kind of changes at a much wider level have taken place? I would say two things. Rice. The massive extension of the rice trade that goes on with the massive reclamation projects that are in some sense just ongoing, and yet on the other hand attain a new kind, I would argue, a new character in the early 19th century. That's one thing. Commercialization. Now it's very hard to say much about this commercialization in any detail, in the sense that, you know, the argument is obviously there that the rice trade is very old. It's very hard to say much because, you know, in a place like the Bengal Delta, a new delta, the Eastern Delta, all you really need to have a thriving commerce in rice is a surplus, and clearly there's a surplus. There is going to be plenty of rice to be sold to merchants. That tells you almost nothing about social relationships, except that someone needs cash, and that it's a good idea to sell things, because it always is, if you can. But that I essentially am an autarkic producer in some basic sense, not necessarily individually, but we are, at whatever level unit, autarkic producers. That could actually exist alongside a massive elaboration of commercial society. The question is, at what point does that kind of commercialization begin to enter into the forms of social relationship that actually organize life on the ground? I think that in the first half of the 19th century, something is happening at that level. That is to say, that commerce is ceasing to be simply the selling of that surplus. Something more is happening than that. The other key issue is going to be the way in which, I'm going to draw this in the broadest possible terms, okay, just to keep it. By the mid-20th century, it turns out that capital is the only thing that is keeping people alive. How do we know that? Because when capital stops flowing, people die in vast numbers. Okay. So we know that by the mid-20th century, people's capacity to live is dependent upon the flow of capital. Now, I take this as an old argument, but it's basically an argument about the subsumption of labour. I think there's been a process that has been going on unevenly and also discontinuously, whereby people have become both highly commercialized and at the same time dependent upon capital in order to be able to live. So it's those two kinds of histories that I think are really the issue. It's not about day-to-day life in the sense of personal interactions. Honestly, it's very hard to know. Right? I wish the archive existed. It would be wonderful if it did. I can only extrapolate at the level of relative generality from the issue of characterizations of commerce and of credit structures and at the level of property relations in terms of the way the colonial state tried desperately and failed to keep track of them. I mean, remember, I don't need to tell you this, one of the basic problems of property in a delta is that it doesn't stay still. Right? And the whole very notion of creating property in an English sense is that a property isn't going to change very much, and unfortunately that's just not the reality. Right? So this is a constant problem, but the one good thing about that is that it does throw up some information about who's doing what on the land a little bit, because, you know, even with the very thinnest colonial state, as it is in Bengal, the thinnest of all, they do actually throw up some information about this.
I don't expect you to answer this, but there's something that's always intrigued me. Whatever happened to Marxism? Because all we know is that the thinkers were Catholic and there must have been
The fabric production, not cotton. The fabric production. Silk production. Muslin.
Muslin production. It was the silkworms. It was
No.
Cotton and textile.
Oh, sorry.
So maybe that's another huge thing to talk about. But there was a commercial culture, and Bengal was known for its textiles. Ever happened to that? And my real question is, let's take you out of Bengal and into the UK, where this 1880s is the time when Machuano was writing culture and anarchy. And then he, similar to Hawking, is actually looking around him and seeing that, with the demise of religion in a way, that it's the sweet thoughts of poetry.
Because when I was looking at 19th century Wahhabi documents, you will find how deeply rooted the ideas of social justice are in the Wahhabi documents. So the initial resistance, one part of it is that the Muslims want their own empire back, but another part is that the peasant wants justice in the Wahhabis. When I was reading the Wilkinson book, you do not see any presence of the memory, including the memory of the first family. So I was wondering whether intellectually these people were being fed by a completely different set of ideas than the one you presented. While the Muslim agricultural politicians, including further, were being fed by a completely different set of social memories, so that the space for convergence was probably impossible because there were probably two histories.
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it that way. Bonkin actually renounces memory, right? When he attempts to reclaim tradition, the first thing he tries to do is render a form of Vaishnavism that has absolutely nothing to do with any form of Vaishnavism that anyone has ever practiced before. Right? Though, in the end, it creeps in here and there, right? Nonetheless, despite himself. But mostly, it's a renunciation. It's an argument against the kinds of Vaishnavism that actually exist in favor of a better one, right? The question of memory is on the agrarian side is very interesting, and it goes in many different directions. So, for example, I said before, there's this old right, the right of occupancy, the right to subsistence, basically, my right to the land, right, as a means to live. This is a very old thing, and it's pretty much, I think, everywhere has it in the old world, at least, right? It's in the Ottoman world for sure. It's in Europe, the Roman war for sure. I mean, it's pretty much across the board, to the best of my knowledge, this idea that people have a right to the land in order to exist. That's a subsistence notion of what it means to have access to the soil, right? And the state has to recognize that in some qualified way, at least, to be able to extract wealth from the soil. That's something that exists side by side with this language of labour constantly. It's never forgotten. And in fact, it's used to articulate the idea of labour. So in agrarian politics, if you look at Kashani, for example, what you see is that he actually deploys both ways of speaking side by side with each other, almost with the implication that they're variations of the same thing. Right? He doesn't choose, in other words. It's very strongly there as a way of talking about what right is, and sets them in a position, as it were. So yes, it's true, but what I would then emphasize is that what this, for me, suggests is that these memories, instead of thinking about them in a straight line, memories descend through time to us and react upon them, is that memories are capable of being rearticulated to mean something different. Right? That is to say, the old right to subsistence can now be rearticulated as a way of talking about something else. And I think that's why I say what someone like Bashani is doing. He's articulating a memory, an old way, in a way that clearly has deep resonance for many people around him. But he's saying something new, right, on the basis of it. He's not saying the same thing. So the question of memory and the question of newness are not opposed to each other. They're actually, I think, entirely commensurable with each other.
Thanks a lot for a very, I think, for a very interesting and lively discussion, which has thrown up a lot of questions amongst us. People, please have tea and continue with the discussion when we're having So, how colonialism to the spot, even in English politics, sources, not just from the ground in this BRAC, regarding who he was reading.
I won't answer the copy. I have thoughts on the copy question, but I won't answer that textile question. I would say though, the degree to which the textile industry is massive on a world scale, there's no question, but to the degree to which it represents a general commercialization of Bengali society in the 17th and 18th century is actually, I think, contestable. If you look at it as a sort of a percentage of the population in terms of but the issue, one of the great advantages I claim for my system, my approach, is that it allows us to think about those kinds of international connections, and it allows us to think about them not only within the colonial relationship, but beyond the colonial relationship, right? So, yes, Matthew Arnold is concerned about anarchy, right? He's concerned about the Hyde Park rioters. And it's specifically in the context of the Hyde Park riot. I'm not saying it actually comes from the Hyde Park riot, but it's very explicit on the page. It's also very central to his preoccupation. What does a society that is harmoniously organized look like? It does not look like this, he says. It's central to Comte's thought, actually. He's concerned about the revolution and the chaos of rights. And he wants to abolish that kind of anarchy, and he wants to abolish political economy along with it. And actually, it's also central to agrarian politics. I mean, one of the things I've argued is that the emergence of this politics is something that the agrarian politics of rights is actually something that is also of deep concern to people in Britain itself on the liberal side. The realization that the kind of ideal of a liberal society is very hard to achieve in the context where most people's labour doesn't produce property is something that even the central figures of the most libertarian liberalism, like Cobden, are having to think about. And so you have a whole generation of advanced liberals, new liberals, who are very concerned to ask the question, if we want a society of people participating in civil society, what are the necessary conditions for that to happen? Well, it turns out we need to give people some kind of stake. So you have arguments about, I mean, it's maybe, you know, ridiculous in retrospect, but the project emerges very prominently in advanced liberalism. We need to give workers garden plots, right? Why? Because they need to have something, and as Cobden puts it, the only thing that people in general can have if they're to have nothing, if they're not to have nothing, is land. So land reform is the only means by which a civil society can be preserved. That's on the British side. Those people are the same people who begin making arguments about occupancy rights, riot property, right? You know, these are the same people. Shuffling back and forth, so yes.
So,